changing landscape of business solutions. Captives have emerged as a compelling strategy for companies aiming to gain control over their healthcare outcomes. And unlike traditional insurance models, captives represent a form of self-funding that allows businesses to tailor their coverage to their specific needs, often resulting in a significant cost savings and improved service quality. This approach not only empowers businesses with a greater autonomy over their health insurance policies, but also fosters a culture of health and wellness within their organizations. So at the heart of captive insurance lies the principle of shared risk, which encourages participants to adopt proactive measures in managing their healthcare services. And so today's discussion will actually explore the multifaceted advantages of captives, their operational mechanics, and why an increasing number of businesses are shifting towards this innovative insurance model. A fitting quote to set the tone for today's episode comes from Warren Buffett, who once said, "Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing." Captives by design offer companies a direct involvement in the management of risk, turning the traditional concept of insurance on its head. Let's go. Bringing light and wisdom to this intricate topic, I have the pleasure of welcoming my friend, Spencer Smith, to the show. Spencer isn't just any expert. He's a renowned podcaster and sage in the self-funding techniques, and truly a maven in the world of stop-loss and specifically captive solutions. His deep understanding and practical insights into how businesses can actually leverage captives to their advantage make him the perfect guide for today's exploration. Spencer's laid-back approach and knack for demystifying complex concepts have really earned him a revered spot in the world of podcasting, especially among his visitors who are really eager to crack the codes of effective business strategies. Spencer, welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, what's up, Troy? Good to see you, man.
We got a lot of airplay on the last conversation we had, so I'm excited to have this one. It's a little bit different. Cool. We were talking about self-funding last time, and this time we're going to be talking about a version of self-funding. But one thing I actually wanted to talk about was a little bit about your show, man, before we kind of get started, because I'm obviously a fan, a big fan. And, some of the stuff you've been doing pretty consistently for a while has always been incredible. I mean, you talk to a variety of different professionals across private equity, across the healthcare industry in general. But one of the things I really am enjoying is your Tom Broker sessions that you've been doing, because they're just like, I think you personify the broker that I've met over the years, the 15 plus years I've been working in this industry, just perfectly. And so not only that, you have a lot of fun with it. So,
well, I'm glad you're having fun watching them. Yeah, I mean, they're fun to make, man. And it was this idea, right? And it's satirizing, right? It's an extreme version of the quote unquote bad broker. But, it's kind of fun because we all know a guy or a gal that exhibits some of those qualities. And so for just comedic effect, right, we just exaggerate them to have fun with it. But yeah, I think you can teach that way too, Troy. I think humor can teach, and you can kind of tell the truth through humor as well. So it's been fun, man. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you like them.
Well, I want everybody who is listening to this podcast and followers of me, make sure that you're connecting with Spencer on a self-funded with Spencer, because not only are you going to get Tom Broker, but you're going to get an amazing group of very professional people that know what they're talking about, the ins and outs of more than just healthcare, but of business and strategy and all sorts of amazing things. And even go back to his old videos where he talks about self-funding and specifically talks about the mechanics of it and things like that. I think those are very educational, as we dive deeper into today's topic. So,
well, I appreciate that, man. And the crazy thing is those videos that I had no idea what I was doing 4 years ago still circulate to this day and still end up having some really high viewership. So it's like, hey, man, we can spend all this money and all this stuff doing, wild cinematography, but at the end of the day, if you have good content and the value from an educational standpoint is there, people will watch it,
Yeah, just the man in a grease board.
Yeah. Yeah, look at Dr. Bricker, man. He, Dr. Eric Bricker, like he literally goes, I'm just going to have a whiteboard. I'm just going to hand draw it. I'm just going to talk. And he gets tens of thousands of views because it's so good, man. Anyways, all right. So I'm ready when you are. Kick it off, but I appreciate the intro, man. Thank you for the kind words.
Yeah, no, I love it. So today we're going to be talking about captives and what are they? The concept that is kind of growing in popularity and some of the mechanics of it. So let's just dive in here, Spencer.
Sure.
For those of us that are new to the concept of captives, could you just take a moment to break it down for, in layman's terms, the fundamentals of what make up that, and then maybe contrast that with the traditional model we're all used to?
Sure, man. So I'll keep it as simple as possible for today's conversation. And I think a lot of people, Troy, get like scared of that term captive. It almost sounds like you're being held hostage, literally, like, oh, I'm captive now. So like that, just the naming convention, I honestly wish there was a better name for it. But ultimately, a captive is a form of self-funding, right? But the idea is you can rally together and assemble a bunch of small to mid-sized employers, combine them, and finance the risk collectively so that they end up looking and feeling like a Fortune 5 or a Fortune 10 company instead. So it's simply just a version of self-funding that creates some efficiencies and reduces the volatility of being self-funded if a 50 or 75 or 100 life group were trying to do that on their own. So think of it in the context of the second part of your question, man. It's a community of these types of businesses that want to accomplish the same goals, and they're willing to buy into that community. It is the antithesis to that world of where you're standing on your own, whether you're fully insured or self-funded. And especially in the fully insured world, I think that's the starkest contrast against what we do, which is where everything is deferred to an insurer in 12 months at a time. They give you no data. They really kind of have this whole competitive moat around your data and your claims. And then they get to dictate what your pricing is next year. And you have really little recourse or literally information to determine why they came up with that figure. And you kind of go, well, I guess I'm at their mercy. They're telling me I owe this, and now next year my renewal is X. We think that's a really sucky way to finance healthcare, and I think a lot of employers have been trained to be stuck in that mindset. And so Pareto and these captives exist as a stark contrast to that.
Yeah, I think it provides, first of all, an entry point for a lot of smaller organizations to experience what self-funding looks like.
Yeah.
But the parts that I think are most significant is the transparency and the levers that you can pull on to really start to change the trajectory of your healthcare spend in a meaningful way. Because without that information, you're kind of beholden to whatever the underwriter thinks is fair and equitable for the organization to continue to serve you and manage it. And the cool thing about captives is it's not just one thing. There's a lot of flexibility in there for you to kind of pull together the pieces you want. And so maybe talk about that, because, a lot of times, like you said, there's some misconceptions around, well, what does captive mean? It sounds almost hostile, right? Like you're just holding me. But there's so many different ways that you can kind of put it together. And I know Pareto does a great job. Pareto is the leader in the captive industry. So I do want to throw that out there. You've definitely stepped it up in that area, and you've built a very, very large group of performing organizations that all kind of collectively care about the things that make healthcare work.
Yep.
So maybe just talk about that a little bit, and what you're doing today and why it's really revolutionary.
Well, to your initial point, that the nomenclature, the naming convention, right, is a turnoff. And we one of the things that I think Pareto has done the best is simplifying the understanding of it so it doesn't seem so scary. But we often say, and we're not probably the only ones that say this, is when you've seen one captive, you've seen one captive. They literally are all different in many different ways. We happen to be the biggest, and the biggest by a pretty wide margin. We're pretty flexible in what we'll underwrite. But ultimately, we also have brought some really cool cost containment tools to the table as well that groups can select that are turnkey, and the pricing is really, really fair. And so it really depends on what are you trying to accomplish as a consultant at the end of the day. Think of the captive as just the vehicle to accomplish the end that you're trying to achieve. Now, granted, every captive is different. There are definitely different strengths of each one. But our job is to assemble the best risk financing, which is the stop loss. And so making sure that contract is the best we can offer, and then bring those tools into the fold as well, and maybe even incentivize really just good behavior. So these employers will come to the member meetings with us every single year, and they will hear from other employers in the same industry or in the same geographic area, and they will go, hey, what are you doing, Sally? What are you doing, Tom? They'll hear from other CFOs that sit in their seat, and so they connect with that. And there's generally this semblance of like, oh, I feel like I'm rowing in the same direction as a bunch of other really smart people, and you're sharing those ideas very freely amongst each other. And so I say that word community, I'll say it again. It's like you facilitate this community of businesses that really want to control the destiny of their healthcare, and you give them the vehicle, which is the captive, to be able to achieve that. And so it's been fun, man. It's been refreshing. I've been here for a year. It's a perfect alignment of my philosophy and what I love to talk about. And so it's one of those things where like I feel like I landed a dream job, man. And so I love talking about it every day with folks like you.
Yeah, it makes it easy to roll out of bed every single morning and do what you do, right?
It does, man. It absolutely does. Yeah.
I say that in a meaningful way, primarily because I know that the industry needs reform in the areas of cost and transparency. But I also know that a lot of the traditional models are still running very strong. So, you know, if a company is considering potentially a transition or alternatives to what they're doing because it doesn't feel like it's working for them, their population, their people, talk about what is transitioning to a captive kind of look like, and when is the right time to make that move?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you probably a full answer, but it'll be kind of a long answer. But let's put in proper context maybe the size segment we're talking about, right? So let's start with the notion that it's really designed for the small to mid-size employer market. So let's call that 50 to 1,000 for just easy range of reference. Doesn't mean both sides of the equation have some flexibility, but that's kind of the sweet spot for a captive. And so the notion again is like, if you can bring a bunch of these little employers that want to be self-funded, but have maybe shied away from it or had bad experiences in the past because it was too volatile for them standing on their own, now you have a way to combine those together to make them bigger. So that's like kind of premise number one. But I think from a transition standpoint, part of your question depends on, well, what am I in today? Am I in a fully insured plan? Am I in a level funded plan? Am I already self-funded? And again, I'm just seeking to sort of increase my scale. And so I'll join something like a Pareto. But let's use the most obvious one, which is that fully insured transition. So again, that idea of fully insured, you prepay for your health care, you pay premiums every month as a business owner, and in exchange, all that risk goes to that insurance carrier, but they don't give you any data, they don't tell you what's going on, but at least it's predictable, and it's the easy button of health care. And so what we would work is alongside a consultant and the employer, so usually the CFO, the CEO, the CHRO, et cetera, and we say, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Do we want to go radical disruption to get the maximum possible savings, or do we want to stair-step our way into being self-funded? And so maybe we keep the same network that we have today. Maybe you keep a similar administrator. Maybe even your PBM will look and feel similar. Those things are achievable. So then it comes down to, what is the mindset of that employer? If we know what their goals are, we have a vehicle that's flexible enough to achieve those goals, but it's really dictated by the strategy that they and their consultant put forth on the table, and then we're willing to partner with them on that.
Yeah, no, I do think it starts with their mindset and where they're at, and I do think fully insured works for some people. I think that's the right place to be at certain times. And so if you're working with a consultant, they need to make sure that that's still a viable option for you. But why do you think that more consultants, brokers, are not talking about captives?
I think it's still a relatively new space. I mean, we're about 12 years old in total, and that's about, the space is slightly older than that, but it's so new. It came from the P&C world, and please don't make me explain how it works on the P&C side because I can barely spell P&C, but it came from the P&C world. Okay. But now it's still relatively new. And then you added in the perception, and I really do believe it's a perception once you understand it, that it's complex, that it's really sophisticated, that you need to be a CFO to be able to understand it. And so most people get a little bit scared, and consultants included, because you guys as consultants are obligated to sort of know everything, right? Like that's the expectation of you, is you literally know the entire market. And so we are one facet of health insurance, or the medical side. And so because it's perceived as complex, and because it's not something that consultants have been doing for 30 years, it's just an awareness and an education thing. And so again, when I enter into specifically talking about Pareto and my job here, it's like education is the primary thing that we do. If you educate somebody about this space, more often than not, they come to the conclusion, yes, that is the right fit for me. I want that. But if you don't lead with the education, you start going into whiteboarding risk layers and all this, capital and collateral, and, all of a sudden people go, what in the world is this guy talking about? I don't want that, right? So the way that you sort of ease people into understanding it is also an art form a little bit as well.
Yeah, perfect. synchronicity of art and science, right? Because data is really a key indicator of whether this is going to fit with you or not. And so you need access to that data first to really make those decisions.
We're willing to, right? If, let's say we educate you and, it's not a fit. I don't like it. The concept doesn't resonate with me. Like, it's okay, right? We want employers, ultimately, where you mentioned mindset. We underwrite for mindset first and foremost. And so we want employers that go, yes, that is the thing I've been looking for. Okay, now let's really start to explore. And we can get into sales process and how we're different there. But Troy, I was going to ask you, maybe I turn the table a little bit on you. How come consultants, you don't think broadly talk about captives as much as you and I think maybe they should?
Yeah, I think you look at the population of most brokers, and a lot of them are on the back nine. You look at the average age, right? Yep. And it's complex. It takes a lot of education, as you mentioned, and it's easier sometimes to just go with what is in place, is what I've seen. And for organizations that are looking for something different, a lot of times they're not hearing different options. I've seen some adding some functionality around technology to support things. A lot of times data, if it is present, isn't used in any way. It's just like, hey, here's your data. Here's really to support why you got the 25% increase, but not at the end of the day, there's no action that is taken on it, right? And so, one of the things I love about just the self-funded model, and specifically the captives, because they've kind of refined it a little bit more for the smaller employer, is that there are compelling reasons why you would plug in just certain vendors and strategies, because it's all about proactive health management. Because if you look at the total cost of a healthcare plan, let's say 20% of that is made up of administrative costs, stop-loss insurance, et cetera. 80% of it is claims, right? Yeah. And so in a captive, I think you're doing a good job at squeezing the administrative cost, squeezing the stop-loss cost, but there's also that very specific focus on how do we get better outcomes? How do we improve health, right? And the only way that you can do that is with data and with good strategies. And so my belief is, whether it's self-funded or it's a captive, that is one of the most important parts, because you can only shave so much off those other two, right?
Absolutely. But I think it's like when you start to really talk about the nitty-gritty a bit, and you think about the insurance side, the financing, right? I called it risk financing earlier. Mm-hmm. That is only viable and sustainable if the risk mitigation, i.e. the claims that you're talking about, are also guardrails are put in place, right? And we don't go so far as to enforce really restrictive choices. Some captives do that, and that's fine, right? Because they're like, no, this is the way it's going to work, and we want to maximize outcomes, but you obviously narrow the pool of employers that are interested in doing that pretty significantly, right? But ultimately, it's setting up the framework and also establishing incentives to encourage best behaviors, right? And so it may not be in year one that they do kind of the more radical stuff, but maybe we know, hey, in year two and year three, we're going to start rolling these things out with our comfort level as an employer. And that's also where you have to really consider, and I talked about kind of sales process before, but I'll go back into that, Troy. This is not a one-year decision. If you have employers that are reacting significantly to a bad renewal and they're just trying to chase something cheap on paper, this is going to be a terrible option for them. Mm-hmm. We're going, hey, do you want something that's sustainable, that you're making a decision now, so 5 years from now, your healthcare is still in a much better place, and the decision-making process every 12 months is less sort of arduous when it comes to marketing and RFPs and stuff like that. Ultimately, this is a choice that you're doing for the long-term health of your business. And so if you're not of that mindset, or that doesn't appeal to you, then a captive is probably not your best bet.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet out there that is just going to provide you significant savings year one and then forever if your healthcare issues aren't addressed, if you're not looking at the weight loss craze that's going on there with the Wegovy and the Ozempics and the GLP-1 drugs, or you're not looking at gene therapy drugs that are about to roll out that might be $3 million for everyone, right? So talk to me about this. You talked about flexibility, and that's what I love about captives. It's really about providing you all the things that you can get from a self-funded standpoint, but also being flexible, and how you deliver those things. And it is a multi-year, multi-step process to achieve the goals that you want to get. And the good thing about that, I think, is that look, you're already biting off a lot by saying, I want to do something different, but let's not make it so different that your employees are just like, this is terrible. Like, this is the worst thing ever, right?
Yeah.
Let's actually laser in year by year, step by step, and focus on the things that are driving some of your negative.
It's the proverbial cliche, right? At this point, it's crawl, walk, run, and then maybe you add fly on the end of that, depending on the employer. But yeah, there is one of the misconceptions is you've got to go all in overnight, and that seems pretty scary, since even the idea of going self-funded for some of these employers seems like a little bit terrifying. And so then just easing them back from the ledge to go, no, like, we'll move at your pace. We will ultimately work alongside you, and your consultant is really the one driving the strategy. Pareto is just the vehicle to accomplish that. And so we will, again, work at whatever pace they're comfortable with working at.
Yeah, no, I love that. You mentioned setting up a captive. A lot of people would perceive it maybe as daunting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a moment. What is reality, and maybe contrast that to what they're used to?
So when you say setting up a captive, like establishing a new captive or a captive cell, or
no, I'm not.
Yeah, okay.
Specifically, I'm an employer. I have 100 employees. I'm on traditional insurance.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm on level funded. What does it look like to potentially move into a captive model with Pareto, as an example?
Yeah, so ultimately, again, when we start with mindset, let's assume we've had that conversation. They're all in on what they hear conceptually, right? And so we start digging into what do you want to achieve, right? So then it's a question of what is the TPA that you want to use? What network, or maybe even a non-network like an RBP solution, do you want? You know, here are our options for prescription, where we've written some really strong contracts and used our buying power. Or are you bringing your own independent PBM to the table, right? So whatever those questions, right, are, then that case gets underwritten. And let's assume it's still within the margin of where that group is interested. Then it's a matter of just locking the stop-loss terms in, right? Obviously, we're going to have implementation teams on our end. Each one of those vendors that's a part of that equation will help them with the rollouts and billing and setting up accounts. And so, you know, I want to make sure that we don't make it sound like it's literally a perfect solution with nothing to think about, right? So one of the things to think about is there's going to be a little more work on the front end setting it up, right? So if you're taking the easy button away from a carrier who's only really offering you an easy button, and that's really it, right? That's where the benefit stops. And so if you go, all right, well, now I need to make these choices, and I've got a few more vendors, and I've got some accounts that'll be set up to take claims out of our, you know, a ledger or whatever like that. Some of those things will require setup. But once it's set up, it's not like every single day you're having to reinvent the wheel. And so you establish that framework to start, and then you actively manage the plan over the course of the years. Now, do you expect a different result doing the exact same thing? No. So you're going to have to do something different to get the different result that you're looking for. And so we're very cautious. We make sure people understand what they're getting into, and then we hold their hand throughout that front end process.
I think it's important to understand too, you know, for the organization, a lot of times it's not necessarily that they have more administration or duties, because a lot of that within a captive is already set up. I mean, you could plug and play. I know this with Pareto, and there's other captives out there where you literally can just, if a client or a consultant came to you, you said, hey, I need a solution that's pretty vanilla right now. You have already the plug and play, you know, solution in place.
Sure.
But the beauty of it is that it doesn't have to stay there. You could say, I don't like that PBM, or we want to do something a little bit different, or we want to have a different third-party administrator. We want to implement this healthcare, you know, management strategy. All those things are still on the table. The best part is that you don't have to figure out all of them. So if there's white space there that you're like, I don't know what to do with that, right? Because we didn't have an idea or strategy. The beauty is, you know, Spencer and your team can pull in those pieces, right?
Right, and that's that's the second part of that mission, right, is the cost management. And so over half, I mean, actually nearly 2/3 of the groups that join Pareto select are what we call integrated cost management, or ICM platform, because those tools have been validated, they've been tested over years and years, they've been proven. And so, yeah, we could do different things, and oftentimes consultants say, no, I want my consortium of PBMs. Okay, fine. But most groups, right? Most groups are going to choose that because they want to sort of be guided as to what's already working and what are the other 1,000 employers that are in that. You know, we have close to 3,000 employers now in our captive. So what are those other couple thousand groups doing? I want the same outcomes that they have. So what are they doing, right? And that's where our program comes into the fold.
Yeah. It just philosophically, your perspective.
Yeah.
As you look at kind of the different market segments, and you mentioned that middle, kind of small to middle market being that 50 plus to 1,000 space. Like, if you're implementing a program, and I feel like you're pretty up to speed with what is happening in the world of self-funding and captives. Like, how do you stair step? Like, philosophically, what would you target kind of year one if you're, in that 50 to 100 space? Maybe you've grown to 200 to 300. Now, what are you looking at? And then you potentially start to move into the captive space. What are you thinking about as you look at healthcare and building these strategies and plans? Because that's really what you're doing, is you're building your own plan within a larger plan, right?
Right. Well, ultimately what I'm looking at is, if I'm going to go self-funded, I want control, right? What do I want? I want to take back control. With that comes choice, flexibility, maybe a little more responsibility. So that's the starting thing. Do I want to take ownership as now a plan sponsor and sort of take that fiduciary standard on as an employer, right? Most business owners, though, are willing to take that step. From there, I think the lowest hanging fruit, Troy, is let's assume we kept the network and the administrator maybe even the same. So I'm just going to use an example, neither here nor there, but I have UHC as a plan today. I'm going to use UMR and I'm going to use the UHC network. The first thing I would probably consider changing is the pharmacy benefit manager contract, right? So working with an independent pharmacy benefit manager that's not only going to help you manage the formulary, going to pass through the rebates 100% to the employer, going to focus on lowest net cost of drugs, and really help guide through sticky situations like specialty medications and even gene therapies and things of that nature. And so I would start the tinkering process there. From that point, the sky's the limit, man. I mean, then you can start going into reference-based pricing and setting up direct contracts. You can look at all sorts of care navigation, and really probably more than we would cover in the confines of this conversation. But that's where if I was a business owner and I became aware of how much I was likely overpaying for pharmacy, that's step number one, man.
Yeah. Pharmacy is the low-hanging fruit, right? Right now.
It really is. I mean, honestly, and probably can't get too much in specifics, but our contracts, save significant amount of money versus what they're probably accustomed to today.
Yeah. And that cost is rising, 3 to 5% every single year because of the large spend that is there.
Well, if you look at trend, and underwriters will put trend on the medical claims and the pharmacy claims, pharmacy trend is always higher than medical claims. So there's a lot of people that believe that at some point in the very near future, most businesses will have half of their expenses going to pharmacy.
Yeah, it's well over 30% now. I think it's getting close to 35. Soon will be 40%, and like you said, before long it'll be 50% because there's so many therapies out there for autoimmune disease and diabetes management and things like that are not only costly, but they continue to come out with new ones, right? So,
well, here's what I would consider, right? Is Ozempic was a great example, or just that class of GLP-1s. Now there's so many people demanding access to them and them to be covered by insurance. But I say be careful what you wish for, right? Because if you sort of carte blanche give open access to drugs like that, and you want insurance to pay for it, well, what do you think is going to happen to the cost of your insurance every single year after that? It's going to go up, right? So you're financing it in the wrong way, and maybe at some point we need, as employers and business owners, say, you know what, I'd rather prevent or maybe control access to certain things unless there's medical efficacy that's established or there's really strong reasoning outside of I want to lose weight and this is the new fad drug, right? And so I think it's almost a philosophy of how we actually control healthcare and what responsibility the business owners have to perhaps say yes or no to certain situations. But if you just sweep everything under the rug, at some point you're just going to have this giant mountain underneath your rug and go, well, how come health insurance costs so much? Well, you're literally paying for everything and you're paying for it in the wrong way.
Yeah, I can imagine that, like 3-year-olds, we're just, mom says, go clean your room. And we're like, we put it under the rug, right? Like,
yeah. Or shove everything into the closet, and then you can't open the closet, or it all pours out.
Or you open it, everything comes out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, it's a mess, and I think that there's a lot of reform that we actually see out there that potentially might be coming through, specifically around pharmacy and things like that. I'm curious around the legalities of these captives. I think when you look at self-insuring or looking into captive, everybody's like, oh, it's so risky, right? It's so risky. Yeah. That's why I don't do it. So I just go with fully insured and I kind of blindly, do that. And I don't think that that's the right way to look at it as well. So when you're looking at kind of the risk, comparatively to, what you would be doing in a fully insured program, how do you kind of judge what makes sense for somebody? Like, how would you walk somebody through that process?
Well, everybody's risk tolerance is different, right? So let's start there, right? I can't maybe presume to know what everybody is thinking. However, I mean, I would say the risk of not doing anything is far worse, right? So there's going to be risk in everything you do. And you said it at the front of the conversation. Risk will always exist, right? We're just talking about financing and mitigating in a better way. And so I would say, well, if you just stay fully insured and do nothing, well, you can count on 10 to 15 to 20% increases year after year forever. And is that worse than maybe taking a little bit more responsibility, actually seeing things now, look under the hood and maybe see where some of the bodies might be buried and things that you can now go solve? Because ultimately, if you can't manage something, you can't measure it. So yeah, captives get the notion of they're risky. Some of that comes from the 831B model, and that's a little bit more about using money to avoid, if you will, some of your costs through taxation, and they can get really gray, and there are some tendencies perhaps to do things that may not be totally above board, right? But that's not what we're talking about with a group benefits captive. I mean, we've been around for 12 years. Like I told you, we've got nearly 1 million belly buttons in all of our captives, right? If it was not legally sound and established correctly, it would have been found out by now, And so I really think about it as once you get over maybe some of that's more just, it's fear of the unknown than anything else. You start to develop a comfort level, and it's one of those things where we'll end calls, sales calls, and people go, well, why doesn't everybody do this, right? Or why didn't I do this sooner, right? It comes down to awareness again and education, man, but I don't think it's anywhere near as risky as people think. And maybe I can't speak for all other captives as well, so let me just say that. I don't know anybody else's captives. However, with us, that's not the case.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on here and demystifying a little bit of it for us, because I preach it every single day. Like, look, what worked for you when you had 15, 20, 25 employees doesn't necessarily work when the world starts to open up to you. And the way that, carriers and PBMs are making money today is different than they were many years ago. And so with that evolution, there's an evolution of solutions that can solve that for you. And I believe captive should be at the top of the list of the conversation to make sure that, even smaller employers can now access a self-funded model that gives them that transparency, the flexibility, as you mentioned before, to enter a marketplace and potentially even move to a fully self-insured or partially self-insured type model as they continue to grow and develop. But any other kind of closing thoughts from you or pieces of advice around somebody who's like on the fence about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're on the fence, it's going to take a real conversation, right? So, I mean, I'm giving you the high level stuff, and a lot of my job at Pareto is just to share the story, share the concepts, but ultimately you got to roll up your sleeves a little bit to figure out if it's going to work for that particular group, or if you're a consultant to work for your clients. And so I can't have that same conversation, but that's where I would go with this. But ultimately, I mean, I'm so bullish on the space, Troy. I featured captives 4 times on my podcast before I came to Pareto, and all 4 of them were some of the most watched conversations I ever had. I think you've got a confluence right now of demand. There's a receptivity from employers. Everybody is looking for something to solve this problem. The captive happens to be the vehicle that makes the most sense right now. And then you combine that, of course, with the strength and size of Pareto. I'm super bullish, man. I could see in the future where even the notion of being fully insured, I don't want to say it's ever a minority of groups, but I think the market share is going to slip there pretty significantly, because once you put these two things side by side, it's really hard to argue in most situations for staying fully insured.
Yeah. And I'm on the same page as you, but I do feel like there's a remnant of people, and certainly a remnant of consultants, that are hesitant for doing this. Part of it might be that they're not ready to be transparent, completely transparent on their compensation. I've even seen some captives built out there that were not. We're also a little bit misaligned in the way they do things. What I love about Spencer
Sure.
and Pareto and a couple others that I've talked to is that they are transparent. There's real opportunities for you to save money and get a look, see at what's actually happening behind the magic curtain of healthcare,
Yeah.
right? Which
Yeah.
I think is important.
Well, we want the same things everybody else wants, man. We want to lower the cost of healthcare. We want more Americans to be able to afford it. We want more businesses to be able to afford to give better healthcare to people. We want the same things, right? And so if this 30-minute conversation we just had is intriguing, to those folks. My hope is that you'll reach out and then we can have a real serious conversation if it's a fit.
110%. So, Spencer, again, thanks for your insights today. As usual, my man, you're spot on. And it's not just enlightening. It's always good fun to chat with you. Really, the depth of your knowledge paired with the ability to kind of make the complex topics approachable are really illuminating for me. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on here. And not only that, but captives are more than just an alternative, right? They are actually I believe, a superior solution. You said you're bullish on it, right? I am as well. And I think if you're a business owner out there and you're looking for ways to be competitive in your benefits, that this captive solution, partnered with a good broker or consultant that actually understands how to bring all the pieces together and support you in that, and really answer the questions, the tough questions around like, why would this make sense for me, or why wouldn't it? Right? That's what you really want to know. That you should reach out to either myself or Spencer, and we'd be happy to help you. And to my audience, stay.
Yeah,
go ahead, man.
Let me clarify too. I just want to say, ultimately, we only work with brokers, and then we have a model where we only work with a select few of them, right? We don't work with the entire market. And so, we certainly are not going direct to employers. So anybody's listening to that's saying, hey, I'm going to skip my broker and go to Pareto. That's not how we operate. And I couldn't agree more that the consultant sort of guiding the ship there is crucial to the whole equation.
Yeah. For sure, man. I just meant, in general, Spencer is always happy to answer questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. If you want to talk about anything else, heavy metal, cars, captives, stop loss, you just give me a buzz. Yep.
Yeah, if you love Mustangs, especially Rouches, this guy, he's a big fan. And so to my audience, stay curious, stay informed, and don't forget to tune into our next episode with more enriching discussions around not only technology, but as you can see, very advanced and innovative solutions like captives. See you next week. Bye.